I thought I would just say a little bit about why we put this event together and why feminism might have a different take on love. And I thought I'd start with two quotations from filmmakers. Both of them are men, actually. But there you go, the internet is dominated by men, and when you put in love, this is what you find. So Rainer Werner Fassbinder, whose film Ali Fear Eats the Soul is showing as part of the season, said, "Love is the best, the most insidious, most effective instrument of social repression." But Joss Whedon said, "Love makes you do the wacky." So which is it? Is love that which controls us, forces us into socially normative positions, particularly perhaps in Hollywood cinema, as we might discuss? Or is love a force of subversion which, through the power of desire, passion, familial love, can cause us to cross boundaries of class and race, to challenge ideas and taboos around sexuality? And feminist criticism and feminist film have taken both of those positions, that love needs to be dismantled, deconstructed, severely critiqued, or that love needs to be redeemed and looked at in a new way. And I think we'll find ourselves moving backwards and forwards between those poles and taking entirely new directions on what feminism might have to say about love, and indeed how feminist filmmakers have renewed and revised our idea of love. I'm going to start by showing a clip that takes us back to the beginning of narrative cinema, to 1929, and the British film. Well, how British it is a debate, but it was shot in Britain, Piccadilly. The filmmaker was called Ewald Andre Dupont, and it stars the amazing Anna May Wong as Shosho, a dancer. And this clip isn't from the film precisely. This is from a documentary called Love Is All, which was released this year on Valentine's Day. It's directed by Kim Longinotto, and it's a look at 100 years of love in British cinema. And she's taken the film and reinterpreted it, and I think it's really emblematic of what feminist critics and filmmakers have done, is not just thrown out previous cinema wholesale, but taken the images they feel passionate about and reinterpret them to make them beautiful and adorable at the same time as critiquing and asking questions about them. So we're going to plunge into the love quadrangle that is Piccadilly, and I'd say particularly look out for how Anna May Wong looks out at us. If we could have the first clip. How sexy is that shot of the handbag? And I think we will be talking about sexy tonight as well. One other reason that I chose that clip is it just contains two incredibly powerful female performances and female gazes, and one reason that I think female viewers have long been compelled by the cinema of love is the chance to see powerful women on screen. So I'm delighted to announce 4 powerful women here on stage tonight. And I'm going to introduce them in the order that they'll be showing their clips, which is not the order they're sitting in, so it's sort of mental puzzle for you. The first person to show their clips will be Desiree Akhavan. She is a writer, director, and performer, and was recently jury chair for the Best First Feature competition at the LFF. Her own Independent Spirit Award-nominated first feature, Appropriate Behaviour, played in the festival last year and was released nationally, and I'm sure many of you have seen it. And if you haven't, it's on the BFI player, so get to it. She was a Little White Lies cover star and has written for The Guardian, as well as appearing in Girls. With Ingrid Jungermann, she wrote, directed, and performed in the popular web series The Slope, and is currently working on a TV pilot, which was selected for the inaugural Sundance Institute Episodic Story Lab.
Well researched.
Yes, thank you, Google. Jane Giles, who will show her clips next, is the head of content, or the head of content, as I like to think of her, at the BFI. She previously worked at Tartan Films and at the ICA, where she was in charge of film programming and distribution. Jane is the author of The Cinema of Jean Genet, Un Chant d'Amour, reprinted as Criminal Desire, The Cinema of Jean Genet, and of the BFI film classic On the Crying Game. She is currently writing a kiss and tell biography of the Scala Cinema, where she was programmer from 1988 to 1992, and what a lot there is to tell. And she wrote about Fatal Attraction for the compendium that accompanies the love season. Annette Kuhn is Emeritus Professor of Film Studies at Queen Mary University of London, a member of the Film Studies tutor team at the City Lit University, and a former editor of Screen. Her early writings on feminism and cinema include Women's Pictures, Feminism and Cinema, and The Power of the Image. Among her recent books are the Oxford Dictionary of Film Studies, which is an incredible accomplishment, and Little Madnesses, Winnicott, Transitional Phenomena and Cultural Experience. Her current interests center around film history, cinema memory, and the cinematic experience. And last, bringing our event to, I think, a climax, we can say, will be CampbellX. They're an award-winning filmmaker-curator who has written and produced and directed the queer urban rom-com feature film Stud Life, now available on iTunes, which was awarded the Screen Nation's Independent Spirit Award in 2013, and the Best Black LGBT Film in the Hotter Than July Film Festival. Best film festival name. Their body of work was honoured at the Queer Black Cinema Festival in New York in March 2009. Image, Memory and Representation was also a retrospective of work programmed at the London Lesbian and Gay Film Festival here in 2007. Campbell has written and published short stories and articles on film, sexuality and gender, and they're currently developing their second feature, Low Rider, and shooting an experimental short on desire and masculine embodiment. So I think you can appreciate what a panel of experts with a real range of ideas and experience we have tonight. So without further ado, I think we should get to the first pair of clips. So if we could have the first clips, and then Desiree will tell you a bit about them. So I think most of us could recite those clips back to front with our eyes closed. What made you pick them for tonight?
Well, I had a really hard time picking clips. I wasn't sure. It's such a broad topic, and at first I was thinking about sex scenes, and I was like, oh, that's a minefield. I should avoid that. And then I was thinking, yeah, exactly. I could go on forever. I think that, speaking personally, the way that I viewed romance and sex and love, I was entirely educated by film and television. That the lessons I learned, I didn't learn about sex from my parents. I learned it from TV. My parents were immigrants from Iran. We didn't talk about this kind of stuff, and they didn't date for more than like a couple of weeks before they got married. Ooh. So that didn't turn out well. But the thing is that I watched these films, and these both came out when I was below 10 years old, and I was trying to piece together what it was to be an adult woman. And it was very clear to me from Pretty Woman is that you have to be attractive, charming, and your problems in life will be solved by a rich man. And I really took this literally. I cannot stress how literally I took this advice. And even though I have very strong feminist ideals, I grew up in New York City, there's this part of me that's so conditioned by this. Like The Little Mermaid was another film I considered pulling from, that I really was like, well, if you've got clams like that, what else is gonna get in your way? So this huge dykey octopus woman that your boyfriend will kill, or your daddy. Those were the teachers I had, and it affected me so deeply. And I chose these two because they were also both career related, that for some reason Working Woman to me, and we couldn't use the whole clip because of time, but the real triumphant climax of Working Woman is when she realizes that the chair is hers, that she's got the nice office. And then there was this huge joy, and the most romantic moment of the film is the precursor to that. And I like that about that film. It's a problematic film in other ways. Sigourney Weaver's character shrewiness is, not awesome. But the thing about that was that they were seen as equals, and her intellect was what brought her the jewel of the film, which was this position and this opportunity to be heard, which I really loved about that movie. And I always thought that their moment in the kitchen was one of true romance, whereas the climbing up the stairs moment in Pretty Woman makes me really uncomfortable still.
So given that, why do you think, and this is for the whole panel, why do you think that we're still so compelled by fairy tales, that fairy tales are still being adapted, whether it's into a Disney animation or into a film with grown-up people like Pretty Woman, where they refer to each other as a prince and princess? So why are fairy tales still such a big part of how we tell love stories?
Well, I'll say personally, I think the way that we speak to children about romance and love is deeply effective. First stories you hear are that of fairy tale love, and you get coded with that. It doesn't leave you easily. I don't know if anyone else has something. they think about that.
Jane?
Well, I think they're very primal stories, fairy tales. We've all read our Vladimir Prop, but, I think you're right, Desiree. They're the first stories that we hear when we're growing up, but they resonate very deeply. I found a lot to say about fairy stories, writing about 50 Shades of Grey for Sight and Sound.
Which fairy stories in particular?
Yeah.
Well, I think it was more like the tropes of fairy tales. The glass and chrome, the dark forest was translated into a glass and chrome palace. It just had that feeling about it.
Mm. Do you think that there are, Annette and Campbell coming from slightly different positions, do you think there are successful alternatives to fairy tales that are making their way up through film, challenging some of that princess in the castle hegemony?
I'm still really listening to what Desiree was saying, and I don't know if it just made me think of my background and the messages that I got, and they seem to be very counter. My mother was anti-fairy tale, and to a certain extent my father. And I think, coming from an African diaspora, I think there's something in which we think the fairy tale is not for us, in a way, because we've experienced the horror. Mm. So I think we come from it at a slightly different angle. I think it's much more twisted and complex, the relation to fairy tales, because very often the fairy tales that we're told are of white people, unless we have folk tales, and they're not fairy tales. The folk tales that we have, like with Brother Anansi, who is a trickster, and a bit of a villain. Those are the fairy tales that are local to the Caribbean and come from an African perspective.
So could you describe Stud Life as an attempt to reclaim that fairy tale and redo it within a mixed and queer community? Because it does have a happy ending, and there is love. And
I didn't say fairy tale. The notion of love equal fairy tale. That's what I meant.
Yeah.
Whereas there is a happy ending, because I didn't want anybody to die for a change in like a queer film. The trans people didn't die. The gay man didn't die, and the lesbians didn't die, and that was good enough for me. Like, no death. And it's amazing to think that that's a thing, in a way. Nothing bad happens at the end. I didn't want there was a lot of bad things during the film, so I kind of wanted it to end nicely.
I think I take on board very much also what Jane has said about the kind of primal archetypal quality of fairy tales, and it's probably bearing in mind what Campbell has said. It's worth remembering that a lot of the tales that are in European culture come from Middle Europe, and so there is a slight alien quality for us in this country for the fairy tales, and yet we've taken them on, and then they've been translated over into popular cinema all over the world. So there are various positions you can take in relation to them, and I think there are some forms of feminist counter-cinema that have taken on board fairy tales and tried to turn the outcomes, the characters and so on, simply by swapping roles, swapping gender roles and so on and so forth, changing endings.
And as Jane said, we've definitely seen a sort of post-feminist cinema like 50 Shades of Grey, Twilight, Red Riding Hood, which are reworking those fairy tale tropes in ways that are enormously popular and sort of exploring some of the darkness, which seems like a good cue for you to introduce your clips. Go into the dark forest.
Okay, Sophie, let me take you into the darkness. So I've actually cheated again, I'm sorry. I've chosen 3 clips because they're interlinked, and I love the way they flow. So the first one is a film called Diversion, which is a British TV film written and directed by James Dearden. And in the clip, you're going to see Stephen Moore, who's also known as Marvin, the paranoid android from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Gallery. And he's having a conversation with Sherry Lungi about why men are unfaithful. And then it's a very short clip, and then that's going to lead into Fatal Attraction. And the third clip is Bridget Jones' Diary, Sharon Maguire, 2001, which has a clip of Fatal Attraction. That's what I'm trying to say. Enjoy.
There's so much to talk about there, isn't there? Not least how that Playboy bunny costume plays into exactly what Desiree was saying about how you learn how to sort of do normative femininity from the movies, and then you base your seduction attempts on what you think. But obviously the way that you've put the three clips together, for me the question is, how did a singleton, a career woman, become the most terrifying figure in 80s cinema and go on to terrify young women like Bridget through the 90s?
Yeah, it's a great question. All three of those clips are from very mainstream pieces of work, the TV piece, but also the huge hits of both Bridget Jones and Fatal Attraction, both not only like worldwide #1 blockbusters, but also films that became cultural phenomena in their own way. So Fatal Attraction changed, basically, that James Dearden famously had to change his story from what he pictured as a hard-working, lonely woman who was driven over the edge, actually to suicide, into an alternative ending. When the film was test-screened by Paramount, the audience was very unsatisfied by the suicidal ending. And also what had happened between Diversion in 1980 and Fatal Attraction in 1987 was that the AIDS epidemic had really ripped through not only a gay community but all sorts of different communities, and the idea of marital infidelity had become hugely problematic. There was no more sort of liberated female sexuality, I don't think. So the woman, Alex, became pushed into this sort of monstrous figure who had to be slain by the end of the film. And I was thinking, when we were talking before about fairy tales, what I really love about Fatal Attraction is not that it's sort of what's the word, kind of backward-looking, very conservative view of female sexuality and employment, but that this, like I say, this monster is unleashed. This incredible performance that Glenn Close gives, where she looks exactly how people feel when they're miserably in love, and she behaves obviously incredibly badly, boiling bunnies, and her character really entered into the lexicon of what it's like to be monstrously in love, and that fascinates me. And I love the fact that it's quoted in Bridget Jones's Diary. Obviously, that's a comedy, that's a satire, it's a completely different genre, and it works on an audience in a different way. It's several years apart. But certainly what you get in Bridget Jones is as well a kind of debate about work, employment, about being man-hungry. And also, to an extent, all three films present a debate about the issue of fidelity and what marriage means in kind of an intellectual way.
Yeah, and it definitely seems that something that Hollywood cinema has struggled with, maybe because of the Hays Code, is this question of fidelity and whether you can show relationships other than, love and marriage and the baby in the carriage and the bunny in the hutch. So,
all three films also have this very scary notion of men as catches, like a woman being completely incomplete without the man, and then rivaling each other for this prize.
Yeah, when one of my starting points in writing about the dark side of love for the BFI Love Compendium was Play Misty for Me, which I think is a really fascinating film. And Roger Ebert, the critic, described Evelyn's character in Play Misty as being like flypaper, actually, and really sort of representing men's fear of being caught by someone that they think is superficially a liberated woman, but turns out to be a completely smothering force for them.
Yeah, and I feel like a lot of women's films from a certain time, the 90s, really play out that and like romantic comedies play out that idea of like every woman is secretly gonna like smother you and destroy you because she's so desperate because she's gonna need to have a baby soon. It's terrifying. No wonder I'm gay.
Which leads me into my next question. Thank you. Good segue. At the same time as you have these films in the 90s and going into the late 2000s, you've got the new queer cinema, which is perhaps looking back to the cinema of the 70s. It's quite dark. It's quite sexually liberated, and it's also imagining these other kinds of relationships. So we're not necessarily showing any clips from them, but I was wondering if the panel wanted to talk about alternatives. So we were talking before we came in here about the women's pictures of the 70s, but also about new queer cinema, which kind of falls between Fatal Attraction and Bridget Jones's Diary. So I don't know who wants to pick up on that. Annette, do you want to say something about the 70s?
There's a history of this. I mean, infidelity makes a good story because there's dramatic conflict. It also keys into all sorts of historically popular genres in film and other popular entertainments. And, these things change over the years. And I was just thinking today, I hadn't thought about this for ages, about New Hollywood of the 70s and how there was a kind of strand within that of a kind of quasi-feminist New Hollywood cinema with films like An Unmarried Woman and Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, Julia, those sorts of films, Girlfriends, which, worked as mainstream Hollywood cinema but could be read within the terms of the feminist concerns of the day, and how that then there's also a kind of feminist film criticism going on at that period, and how that moves into a very, very interesting development in feminist and lesbian cinema of the 1980s, as you point out. I mean, there's films like Desert Hearts, which I suppose predates somewhat the new queer cinema, but there is this sort of strand of interest in sort of what we might call women's pictures kinds of issues around love and infidelity and conflict and having to dilemmas of choice about doing the right thing or following your heart or following your lust.
But people don't die in them.
No, they don't.
Right.
Not normally.
I don't know if you guys want to pick up on what was going on in the new queer cinema, or we can pick that up later.
Yeah, we can probably pick that up later.
So, as well as one of the really interesting things about that clip from Fatal Attraction is we see another kind of love in it. We see a mother at home with her children, which is a love that's very often sentimentalized in Hollywood cinema and has a kind of fairy tale portrayal as well. But I think in Bridget Jones as well, we see Bridget has a very realistic relationship with her family, and that family relationship, her relationship with her friends, are contexts for that more man-hungry aspect of her character. And we wanted to make sure that this panel also didn't just focus on heteronormative love or even just pair bonding, but looked at where we learn to love, perhaps in our relationships with our parents. And I'm going to hand over to Annette to say something about her clips at this point.
Yeah, I've written this down because I kind of tried to develop an argument here. So I'm going to say a little bit about my clips, and forgive me, and then I'm going to show both the clips. I'm going to be showing clips from Stella Dallas, the 1937 King Vidor version starring Barbara Stanwyck, and Chantal Akerman's 1976-7 film called News from Home. As you will know, Stella Dallas is a very famous example of the Hollywood woman's picture. You can argue, I mean, this kind of picture has been fascinating for women and indeed for feminists because it can be argued, and you might want to argue against it, that it's arguably quite progressive in the context of mainstream cinema of its time, in the sense that the defining feature of the woman's picture is that it puts a woman's viewpoint at the centre of the story. So a woman's kind of point of view is centred in the story. And also that in terms of the film industry, it had a very deliberate appeal to women audiences. And by that I mean real women going to the pictures, as well as, or perhaps versus, what in feminist film theory is called the female spectator. Big debate about that. I'm going to show you a short clip from the final scene of Stella Dallas, which you'll know is when Stella goes to look at her daughter's wedding. Her daughter has gone off and been upwardly mobile and has been estranged from her mother by the mother's choice, really, quasi-choice. That I would argue sets up not just a woman's viewpoint but a maternal viewpoint. And Katie Grant has said that this constitutes an almost transcendent exemplar in theories of melodramatic pathos. But it also offers a kind of a triumphant maternal love as a kind of self-sacrificial letting go, which involves her giving up her daughter for an advantageous marriage. And so we got maternal love as loss, maternal love as both triumph and renunciation, in a story that can be summarised as a play of attachment and separation. So the question here is, well, what is feminism to make of that kind of story? You know, it's got the women at the centre, but it involves a mother's renunciation of her daughter. Writing about this scene, Thomas L. Sesser says its emotional tone is visualised in terms of spatial distance and separation. So we get, in the clip, Stella's kind of unreturned look through the barrier of the window. She looks into the window and sees her daughter being married to this posh guy. And I think that idea of spatial distance and separation makes an interesting comparison with News from Home, because you could say that the whole film is a meditation on spatial distance and separation around mothers and daughters. It was shot in 1976, so it was after her big success with Jeanne Dielman. Akerman had spent a couple of years in New York in the early 1970s, you know, sort of struggling along and watching lots of avant-garde films. And so she goes back to New York and makes this film, so it's a retrospect in some ways. It's almost 90 minutes long. It's got an average shot length, I worked out, of 89 seconds. So there's a lot of long takes in it, in other words. The shots are of streets and other public places in New York City. Who knows this film? Some of you do. Good. I hope you want to see the whole thing after this. So you get lots of long takes of streets and other public places in New York City. You get ambient sound at varying volumes, and you get punctuated occasionally through all this Akerman's voiceover reading out letters that her mother wrote her whilst she was away from home. Although at points the mother's words are drowned out by the ambient city noise. And all of these letters seem to be saying the same things: my dear little girl, I'm not feeling well, I miss you when you're coming home, etc. So as in Jeanne Dielman, repetition and duration are structuring issues of both the form and the content of the film. So this is so indeed are spatial distance and separation. So we get an interweaving of images and ambient sounds with the voiced over letters, and that kind of betokens a separation. So too, I think, does Akerman's distanced camera. You'll see what I mean when you see the clip. But at the same time, you could say that the letters are bridging the gap between the here and now of New York City and the then and there of back home. So a kind of bridging of away and home. It was incredibly agonising to choose a very short extract from this film, because actually quite a lot of the shots are longer than a minute or two. In fact, all of them are. So I had to kind of choose a clip from within a long take, and this is from one of 3 10-minute long take sequence shots in the film. So 30 minutes of the film are composed of 10-minute shots. that was the length of a roll of film in the days when people shot on film. So it's a bit of a tour de force. But anyway, in this one, this clip is taken from one of these single takes that's set on a subway platform in New York. And the camera's static, there's deep focus. We observe the comings and goings of the passengers and the trains, and we hear one of the mother's letters. And like the other letters in the film, it's kind of rendered in a monotonous chant, and at points you can't hear it under the noise of the trains. So I think that, as in Stella Dallas, what's going on here is a play of attachment and separation going on all the time in a mother-daughter relationship. But this time we're getting it from the point of view of the daughter. We could say that second-wave feminism, from which this arguably is a product, is a form of rebellious daughterhood. There's temporal and spatial distance between the image and the ambient sound as well. Now, I could go on about this, but I won't. When I first saw News from Home as a young woman, I felt that the mother's words were kind of getting in the way of the daughter's desire to be independent and have a real life away from home. Now that I'm older, it feels a bit more ambiguous. In her passionately detached immersion in a life far away from home, the daughter still takes on the mother's words, the letters are voiced, and presumably they've been translated by the daughter. The letters will have been written in French originally. So what do we make of this engagement? There's attachment surely going on, even if it's ambivalent. The daughter needs to make a life for herself, and she strains against the pull of mother and home. If you've seen the film, you'll recall the outcome. I'm not going to give you a spoiler if you've not seen it, but I could go on about that as well, but I won't.
Shall we show the clips?
Can I just say that I just want to say a little coda about Chantal Akerman, who died recently. Because in retrospect, you can see these themes as the beginning of a life's work, from literally giving her child good script, as Alan Bennett says about his mother. The mother becomes a muse and eventually a collaborator. And I think it's significant that Akerman's last film also has home in the title, and it becomes a mother-daughter collaboration, and I think, or daughter-mother collaboration, and I think that is a kind of love, if not a resolution. So, yes, let's have a look at these extracts.
It's just like cinema, isn't it? She's just watching cinema through the window.
And weeping.
Weeping. That's telling the viewer what she's supposed to do. I'm sure everyone in the audience is totally verklempt, so just go with it.
I was thinking Barbara Stanwyck wanted to kiss the bride. Because she said, I have to wait for the face.
Yeah.
And we all know about Barbara Stanwyck.
Do we?
Yeah, I don't know what's going on.
Yeah.
She's lessening up. She's lessening it up.
Yeah, totally. In her real life.
Right. So some kind of play on
Yeah.
her romantic attachments to women in the story of the
That
film.
was my interpretation.
They do look the same age, mother and daughter.
They do.
They, yeah.
Well, that's going to definitely lead us into Campbell's clips. But first, Desiree, your film has a really great mother-daughter relationship in it.
Yeah.
And I was just sort of thinking about these clips and thinking if you wanted to say anything about them.
Well, it's funny what you said about Chantal Akerman's work and bookending it with these films. It's hard not to have, when you make work that's personal, to have it not be a collaboration with the people in your life, and to want to tell their stories and explain the experience of knowing them and being someone's daughter. And I think there's something really powerful about women telling those stories about the relationship they have to their mothers, because we're constantly navigating really negative stereotypes of what it is, and it really is a renegotiation. I feel like every month my mother and I have to renegotiate what our dynamic is, and the more experience I have, the little, like, I get slightly more insight into what it is to be her. and the decisions he's had to make as a result of her circumstances, and circumstances I could never understand. The women in my life, it seems as though their lives reflect that as well, and that's why I wanted there to be that relationship in my film. That like my character in my film, I star in my own film. It's very personal, for those of you who don't know it, and my character comes out to the mother and not the father, and people are always asking me in Q&As, what happened to the father? Why don't we hear about the father? And I was like, he didn't matter quite as much. Like that revelation mattered so much more to the dynamic of the mother and daughter than it did to the father in that story, and I didn't really care to go into the father dynamics because you're kind of owned by the person who birthed you. It's really weird, but I felt more ownership and responsibility to respecting my mother and telling a little bit more about her story. And it's funny because right now I'm writing a book, and I want to interview her for the chapter about our relationship. I was really keen to find out her perspective of her move from Iran to New York. And I know this is totally off topic, but there's just something really, I think a mother is the person who teaches you how to love in a very different way than your father does. And they both teach you, obviously, and it's a really powerful relationship, both of them. And there are this whole genre of films. This reminded me of Mildred Pierce, of like the sacrificing mother, which is, I guess, why it's so fascinating on screen to see the different dynamics of the woman who literally like pours her blood into her kin. You don't see that on screen with men.
Campbell, you also made a film with your mother.
Yeah, where I made her whip me naked until I bled. So
Your real mom?
My actual mother, who enjoyed dressing as a man and whipping me.
Nicely done. That's really impressive. That's a big ask.
She was up for it.
Tell us what you think about mother-child love on screen.
How do you broach that conversation?
know,
I'm
right?
like, hi mom, we're making a movie.
I know.
I'll be naked. You'll have a whip.
She was just like, what am I going to wear?
Classic woman.
She's hardcore. I think it's very complex because I think a lot of people speak from the position of femininity, and I really don't know anything about that. So, except from people I've had relationships with, and so I can hear a lot of things people are saying about their mothers. But personally, my relationship was to my father, and I hung out with him a lot. So I learned how to love from my dad. Really, he's a very loving man. So I suppose in lots of the kind of analysis of films, I always think, whoa, okay, that's interesting, but it's never how I see things. And sometimes I think maybe I shouldn't make films because I don't have that dominant perspective at all. When I was looking at the clip with Bridget Jones, and she's meant to be the dumpy person, and I'm like, wow, she's banging, man. It's like, curves. But in dominant forms, it's like sometimes I just can't get my head around what we're being told we should be seeing in terms of...
God, good for you. Good for you. I mean, I just feel like we should have more perspectives from people. I am totally brainwashed by the images and the mainstream images. So it was really important for me to pick a mainstream film because it's a luxury to know about experimental cinema. I wasn't introduced to Chantal Akerman until I was 21. So that luxury, that education, and to not feel that way, I don't know, I want more films like that.
But I suppose, there's the thing about, we talk about the male gaze and we talk about the female spectator, but I would opt for there's a queer spectator as well who sees something a little bit differently too. So, Bridget Jones walking down in that bunny costume and her breath pouring out, I'm like, they missed out. Or when Glenn Close throws up at the family scene,
You
I'm
missed
like,
out.
yeah, exactly.
No, I don't want to high five to that. I don't want to put Glenn Close in people.
But there is another way to, or maybe I'm just weird. I don't know. I'm just like, I laughed because I thought, yeah, that's an appropriate response.
Close escape.
Oh, to the bunny, to like any married family hanging out in front of the fire.
It's like, because, come on, we're just fed that all the time. So, when I saw that initially, I laughed. And then I saw it again, I remembered, and I laughed. I was like, yeah, I was kind of on her side until she boiled the bunny. And then when she died, I was sad.
Spoiler.
Yeah, guys. Come on.
And she had curly hair, and like curly hair is a trope for like not good person.
It's true.
I think it.
Oh, I was just going to
The
say.
bunny was blameless as well.
Yeah, there's all these little tropes that they put. If you're a woman, sleek hair, contained, and curls aren't contained.
I chose the clip having just seen John Waters talking next door in NFT1, and he was talking about how if somebody throws up in a film, it's like, the most fantastic moment for him, and only happens in art house cinema. And I chose that moment because I thought, she throws up because she sees this image, but also because she's pregnant, and you've just had her. Scene of her before that in a car, and Michael Douglas is listening to a tape of Alex talking in the car, where she is getting angrier and angrier on the tape, and she's accusing him of hating women, and then she accuses him of being homosexual, and it's really, really fucked up tape recording. But you're right to say what great moments in films, and they were chosen absolutely out of celebration.
I like Bridget's Parker. I think that Parker bunny combination, that's just got it going on.
She's so luminous.
But this idea about sort of excess and rejecting the mainstream, it's making me think about Je suis elle, Chantal Akerman's film, and the scene where the main character just eats sugar. And she eats a whole bag of sugar, and she's just sitting on. It's almost like that's how we consume cinema sometimes. Like,
absolutely.
And then we feel sick, and we go out and make something new, and that seems like a good cue to go from Je suis elle, one of the first experimental lesbian films, into the clips that you're going to introduce, Campbell.
I love your segues, by the way. I'm like, wow, Sophie's brain.
I want to do them on a segue.
So hot. I know, right? Okay, I'm going to do what you said you wouldn't do. So I'm showing some sex scenes, right? Because, oh my God. Like, oh, sex. Yeah, maybe not. Anyway. Because I was.
Is your mom gonna whip you in one of them?
No, actually, no. But my mom did like my film, and I just a short little anecdote, because I don't know if anybody's seen Stud Life, but it's got a lot of BDSM, sex in it, and kind of just out there in some ways, and quite poignant in other ways. And my parents saw the film at a festival, and I was kind of freaking out because I wasn't sure. I hadn't kind of warned them about what was happening, what they were going to see, and they said they'd phone me when the film was when they'd come home from the screening of the film. So I was counting down, like, right, they should be in the car should take, and they phoned me as soon as they got home, and I said to them, how did you find the film? And my mum was, oh, my darling, I loved it. She calls me darling. I loved it so much. It was a really good film. I was very surprised. And I said to her, well, what about the sex scenes in it? And she said, oh, darling, I've seen it all before. So I was just like, whoa, okay. I don't feel bad now about anything in the world. So hence these clips. So when I was thinking about choosing the clips, a lot of things went through my mind, and first of all was desire. How do we represent desire in a feminist way in film? Because a lot of times people, when they talk about desire, say desire is around power, and feminism is about deconstructing power, removing power. In terms of gender and gender relationships. the other thing that I thought about was very often, and I'm showing two lesbian sex thingies, sex bits, leisure action, whatever you might want to call it. And very often, a lot of the dominant arguments and discourse is around authenticity. Oh, is this what lesbians would do? This isn't what lesbians would do. You know, oh, this looks bad or this looks good. Not really. I think, I mean, I don't really care. I think probably some lesbian somewhere in the world has done scissoring, you know, like blue is the warmest color. To me, that doesn't really matter. What matters are how the scene is constructed, how the woman is placed within the frame, how much agency does she seem to have in the whole scenario. So I chose two clips, one from Didactics, which is an experimental film by a filmmaker called Barbara Hammer, and it was one of the first portrayals of lesbian sexuality on screen. And I wanted to do something experimental because it's, you know, she is not following the rules of dominant cinema in any way. And that's quite important because I think once you go through the Hollywood financing system, you are bound to obey the conventions a lot of times in order to get the finance. It's not, once you start playing with those heteronormative, heteropatriarchal institutions, I think it's very hard to buck the trend, really. So with her, this film was made in 1974, and I like that it was made at the time before people were thinking about marriage. In fact, people were thinking about not marrying, anti-marriage, against two people coupling in a kind of nuclear family. So in the whole film, it's like orgies, kind of polyamory. I mean, people are just like bodies on top of each other. It's really incredible to see that, and without thinking this is going to sell or this is going to be hot in some way. That wasn't the essay. It was about how can we create something that's very different to what we're surrounded by? How can we do something that's feminist? So, when I first saw it, I was like, whoa, this looks a bit weird. There ain't no story here, oh my God. And now, when I see it, I think, how powerful, because we very rarely see something like that now, because we're so dominated by a relentless, heteronormative, heteropatriarchal, constructed way of female sexuality that's just fed to us in like little sausages into our brain every minute of sausages. The day. I use that intentionally. Okay. And segue nicely into phalluses, my second clip is from The Kids Are All Right, which was made 36 years later, Lisa Cholodenko, 2010. And it's the scene where they are trying to have sex. And it's so interesting that I see a lot of films, I'm on juries, and people send me films to critique. And I always notice when lesbian sex is presented against gay male sex or heterosexual sex in the same film, there are two different sound effects. So the sound effect for the lesbian film, the lesbian sex will be, and for the gay male and the heterosexual sex, it would be, right. So that construction, you will see it. You will see it in films, and I'm like, what is this thing? Do lesbians breathe differently? Yeah, I'd like to ask you guys about that. But anyway, but I notice it a lot. So in the scene from The Kids Are Alright, there's actually sound effects, but they're from the gay men having sex. And I thought it's quite interesting, the construction of this sex scene between two women, 2010, having had a long-term relationship, that it was coitus interruptus. The sex was hidden under duvet, and the only sex we could see was the sex between two men. I thought it was fascinating and problematic, actually. Not that I think Barbara's film is perfect versus Lisa's film being unperfect, but I just thought, I'm looking at the forms, dominant narrative, dominant cinema versus experimental form. So that's all I have to say.
All right, let's should we listen to the last set of clips?
Yeah.
Just close your eyes and listen.
Yeah, just listen. Did you hear the sound?
Oh yeah.
I will say, for the record, I know a lot of lesbians who will only watch gay male porn.
No, I'm not talking about watching it. I'm just talking about the juxtaposition. I'm sure when they're watching it, they're having sex, though, not coitus interruptus.
This may be a discussion for the bar afterwards. One thing that I did notice, seeing it, I don't know if everyone in the audience could hear, but so close up on the big screen, there's also a vibrator noise going on under the duvet. And just something about, I've been watching these clips on my laptop, and something about the impact of watching a sex scene really big on a big screen with dyke tactics as well. It really changes your relationship to it. It changes your visual relationship, your sort of haptic relationship, compared to watching, porn on TV or on your computer. So first of all, I want to encourage everyone to go and see Dyke Tactics when it screens in the season, with two amazing sort of summer of love hippie sex films called Unfolding and I can't remember what the other one's called. Anyway, Connie Beeston's Unfolding, which was an experimental film that became a sex education film. So I don't think that ever happened to Barbara's film. It was never put in a sex education catalogue, but it's still a really remarkable, frank portrait. And what happened between 1974 and 2010? Where did lesbian sex go?
On the internet, I think.
Okay.
I actually think now most people learn about, you were saying about learning about sex in cinema. I think a lot of people learn about sex online, and online is porn. And, a lot of people think lesbian sex is porn. It's equal to porn, and that's where people access it. And, mainstream porn, the ones that are accessible to everybody, not queer porn, because you have to pay for that, but free porn is heteronormative and heteropatriarchal porn. That's where people learn about sex and sexuality. I think also the whole gay marriage thing, or what we call marriage equality, changed people's relationship to experimentation. So in Barbara's film, although that bit was just two women, there is a notion that you don't have to be with just one person. You can be with lots of different people, because I think she's from that generation, that's the experimental generation, that were kind of like unpicking dominant tropes or dominant, maybe their mothers, maybe the message they got from their mothers, was to marry. That was like marry, or, whereas I think now that may not be so dominant. I don't know if people are told in that, that's your only choice. So, because she did get married to a man initially, and then decided that wasn't for her. But I like that it's orgiastic. It uses found footage, and she films people that I think are her friends in outdoor locations. Al fresco. It just seems very laughing.
Sorry, I just only heard that term used for picnicking.
Well, there's different types of eating, honey.
Touché.
So it seems like we've almost come full circle from Well, on the one hand, from Piccadilly, where you have these very powerful glances between women, and there's this sense of this alternative nightlife culture around nightclubs, and cinema as being a medium that is about the risque, is about challenging taboos. To, you know, in the other sense, we've come full circle from kind of the Hays Code Hollywood cinema to The Kids Are All Right, which is kind of edgy, but in the end, it really is a film about love, marriage, and kids.
And the sex is Hays Cody as well.
And the sex is Hays Cody. There's always one vibrator on the floor at all times.
You know, you're not allowed to see, because the whole Hays Code thing was you weren't allowed to see it, you know. Sorry.
Well, it's interesting.
There weren't any crashing waves, though.
When you were talking about it earlier in the green room, it sounded like you were also saying, like, there isn't room for lesbian sex the way that the Dictastics had done it in modern day cinema. That the lesbian sex out there kind of has been hijacked to be this kind of titillating, pornified, like a very specific kind of romance on screen for a very specific purpose, which is to get off straight dudes, and only appealing, like, only featuring very specific kind of women. So the minute you have Julianne Moore and Annette Bening in a bed together, you can only go so far before it gets porny. So, like, they almost didn't even have the space to take off that duvet cover, because then it's going to become that very specific kind of narrative that you have to avoid.
Yeah, but how powerful would it have been to see two older women being sexual with each other? Because the older woman is something that we don't see being sexual. Sex is only limited, you know, once you're 25 and under, that's the only body that's allowed in mainstream cinema to be sexual, unless you're Helen Mirren, you know. So, Barbara Hammer has another film called Nitrate Kisses, in which there are two women in their 70s having sex, very similar to the one in Dictactics. So she always keeps pushing those boundaries, but they're within the experimental kind of framework. Not, you know, she never works in mainstream cinema, and maybe for that reason. There are certain ways now where how films are financed, and we can't get away from the financing, because we can't pretend. Your film was made independently, wasn't it? So how was it financed?
Private investors, lots of private investors coming in at very small amounts, and it was done for very low budget.
Right, so you had a lot of control.
I had complete control.
Exactly.
Over my content.
So my point is, if the director, who happens to be female or genderqueer or whatever, has complete control over their film, you'll get a completely different product to whether it goes through the sausage factory. It's just, you know, I don't know if you...
Yeah, I agree completely.
Yeah, so I think in Desiree's film, Desiree was, you know, showing this is my life, right? This is the life of the people that I know, not your life,
but this is sex as I know it and as I see it, and it was very important to me. And I don't know if that's a response to porn, but maybe it is. I've watched porn. Like, I wondered. That's something like a chicken or egg thing that I have no idea about. I just knew that I wanted to depict porn, sex as I see it, and I think my lack of discomfort putting my body and my thoughts out there is a result of our porn culture. That, you know, people can be, what's her name? The girl in the Girlfriend experience. That Sasha Grey can, like, be a porn star and then star in a Soderbergh film. Like, that we can have this world where the Kardashians are, like, royalty in America. Not that I'm, like, dying to be a Kardashian, but that, like, our frame of reference has changed so drastically, and that we know about people's sex lives in a way that we maybe didn't know quite the same way before, in detail, like having videos. Like, of course, we knew who was gay or not gay back in old Hollywood, but we didn't have a video of someone peeing on them, which is why I'm so interested in, like, furthering that conversation and depicting sex the way that I want to see it seen on screen.
And, you know, for me, I don't watch porn, but I also don't watch a lot of dominant cinema, because I just think I don't want that to get into my mind. I think it's very seductive. The thing about the sugar, white sugar, is very seductive. It's in all our food, actually, and health reports just come out. And for me, somebody who's descended from people who were brought over to purify sugar to sell it back,
Ooh, next level.
yeah, it's colonization. I think it's colonization. I think we're consistently and continually being colonized by dominant images of what our sexuality should be. Very often we're not in touch with who we are as sexual beings, because we continue to learn a heteropatriarchal narrative of ourselves. And I think it's very damaging for humans, actually, but I think it's particularly damaging for women who are then placed in a position of not having enough agency in order to define who women are in terms of our own sexuality. And I think that is a huge problem, in cinema in particular, because if we're learning that, it's just like also we learn black culture, which I think is toxic in the music industry, and then we recreate that culture. So it's a similar kind of colonization in my IMHO.
I want to direct this one to Jane, actually, and ask, as someone who is a programmer, do you think that it was more open in the 70s and 80s? Do you think you were seeing, on the indie fringes, the kind of stuff you were programming at the Scala, more kinds of sexuality, different kinds of people involved in those depictions, and different kinds of audiences as well?
Yeah, definitely. Well, the Scala was a repertory cinema, so it showed different double, triple bill every day and all-nighters, and this gave us enormous license to program across film history. So there was classic Hollywood, and there was experimental film, and it was known, King's Cross was a gay enclave, so it's, as one of my colleagues described it, it was like Posthell's Court Priest Soho, and the relationship with the Bell, which was a lesbian bar open to men as well, and the Prince Albert. It was a great triangle. And I'm thinking a little bit, while we've been talking about the sort of range of films that we were showing, films like Kamikaze Hearts was a good example from, I think, the 80s, the mid-80s, but also films like Harold and Maude, talking about, older women enjoying themselves. And there's been lots of films that have been made since then that I could really imagine seeing in that cinema. And, I don't know quite what exists that's like it at the moment, that also really mixed up audiences together, that you could have a kind of a Free Palestine event very rapidly followed by a queer all-nighter, and it was a tough mix, and everyone felt at ease in that kind of environment. I'm very interested in the physical spaces of cinema that really create a kind of license for people to watch across a very wide range of different subject matters, and I'm seeing a little bit of legacy of that now. There's a particular filmmaker, I'm not supposed to say what his new project is, but he's a straight filmmaker who's just made a lesbian love story. He's going off to make a gay sort of 70s New York bathhouse story, and he got his film education at the Scala. Yeah, so more different types of spaces where you can see and be inspired by a wider range of films would help.
And I want to just move that to Annette, and I think we'll have time for one last question, to talk about film spectatorship, because so many of the clips that we saw were actually about watching films, or in the case of both Stella Dallas and News from Home, about women watching. And Jane's talked about spaces of spectatorship, and the question was also about these sort of false ideas we have about what spectatorship exists. And I wonder if you could say a bit about the importance of thinking about spectatorship for feminist film and spectatorship and love, because it's about loving cinema.
Well, it's exactly, yes. I mean, for me, it's this debate is about love, and some of the films that we've seen, including News from Home, I think also Barbara Hammer's film, I think they come from a space of very overtly motivated by a love of cinema. And interestingly, in the period in which those two films were made, we're coming to the end of an era of what used to be called underground cinema. And you can imagine that Dyke Tactics and a film, News from Home is really, I think, an homage to Michael Snow's film Wavelength, among many other things. And you could imagine that, that sort of film by Barbara Hammer. Have you seen Carolee Schneeman's work?
No.
All of those kinds of things in the anthology film archives in New York would have been shown together. And these films come from a love of cinema as much as an interest in or a love of what you're portraying on the screen. And so the gaze in that kind of filmmaking is a cinephilic gaze as well. And I think the question is, where has the cinephilic gaze gone? Is there an institutional context for the cinephilic gaze? Does Vimeo do it? No, not really.
Not really. It's not like the Scarlet.
So I think it's a question of the love of cinema and the cinema of love, I suppose, really, and the context in which we can make these films and see these films.